How should you build every ADC in Smite 2? Each god in Smite 2 has a unique ability pool that can affect their overall auto attack damage. Like Jing Wei, who gains extra crit chance, attack speed, basic attack power and strength from her abilities. Does this mean crit is essential when choosing a build for her? Izanami has a 50% attack speed buff in her kit, which causes enemies to take bleed damage based on her intelligence. Will this make high intelligence builds viable on her if you're trying to maximise DPS? Sol gains attack speed, strength, intelligence and basic attack damage from her passive, and Zeus gains a huge 60% extra basic attack damage when hitting enemies that are fully charged by his passive, making items like Deathbringer gain insane amounts of efficiency on this specific god. We also have aspects which have been added to the game, which give Anhur up to plus 100% attack speed if he only focuses on a single target. And Neith has a unique mechanic that theoretically allows her to gain infinite attack speed based on her strength. Will this mean high strength builds are valued more on her than other ADCs? Cernunnous has multiple auto attack enhancing effects on his first ability. These scale off of strength and intelligence, so will the utility and damage from his first ability affect his overall builds? In this video, we will be considering exactly what combinations of items are best on every current ADC in Smite 2 and why those combinations are the best. For a number of different scenarios and gods, I will present a variety of builds on screen like this. Each block of items here shows the build that has been tested, and underneath shows the TTK, or the time it takes the hunter with this build to kill the entire enemy team with just their auto attacks. Firstly, let's look at a standard hunter. This is a hunter that has been modelled with no extra abilities that increase their auto attack damage. These are essentially the top damage builds when any hunter is at their lowest damage potential. Think of Jing Wei when she doesn't have her attack speed stim up or her explosive bolts active, or Sol at 0 heat. This is essentially the safest hunter builds when you don't want to rely on any hunter's abilities in order to do the maximum amount of damage. I have separated these builds out by starter item. This gives you options when deciding what starter item you want to build at the start of the game and what your personal preferences are. So here are the top 10 builds that will kill the whole enemy team in the fastest time when you choose Hunter's Cowl as a starter item. This first build shows how strong yellow damage items are in the current meta, with Braggy's Harp, Odysseus' Bow, Sunbeam Bow and Kin's all appearing in this build, with a time to kill of 13.88 seconds. This has quite a stark contrast to the next top build, which is much more crit focused, with Deathbringer and Demon Blade appearing in this build. As we move along the list, we can see a lot of items stay the same, with Executioner, Kin's and Odysseus' Bow appearing in every single top 10 build. This is unsurprising, as Executioner is a great penetration item that gives attack speed, two of the most sought after stats for ADCs. Kin's is also a super strong item, doing up to 6% of a target's maximum health as damage, which means it absolutely shreds through tanks and is basically essential for killing the enemy solo laner and support in a reasonable amount of time. Then we have Odysseus' Bow, which provides 45% attack speed and 60% of your auto attack damage as lightning, which arcs to nearby enemies and can proc up to 5 times every 4 auto attacks. This is the equivalent of increasing your auto attack damage by 75%, which is insane and definitely shouldn't be slept on. In my simulation that I ran, I modelled Odysseus' Bow to only proc twice, because the procs are not consistent in a real game scenario, and even though it's only modelled at 2/5 of its damage potential, it still appears in every top 200 build. Outside of these 3 essential items, there is a lot of variation in these builds, which is great for players that don't want to be locked into a certain style of play. We can see quite clearly that Deathbringer is the strongest crit item, and is even viable on its own in a build, which is displayed by the 6th build here, as its passive of increased crit damage compounds better with higher crit chance. It's worth noting here that in my tests, both the enemy solo laner and support have spectral armour, but still crit builds are shown to be absolutely viable. Now let's move on to the new starter item, Sharpshooter's Arrow. This item is a jack of all trades, providing basic attack damage and small amounts of lifesteal, attack speed and crit chance. Here are the top 10 builds with Sharpshooter's Arrow. We can see quite a big contrast of how you should build with this starter item compared to Hunter's Cowl. The 10% crit chance on this item seems small, but when we consider that Deathbringer compounds the efficiency of other crit items, we can see Sharpshooter's Arrow encourages a high crit build, with deathbringer appearing in 9 of the top 10 builds. But this second build does show us that it is not essential at all to build high crit with sharpshooter's arrow. Now we can dive a little bit deeper into a real game scenario, as we haven't thought about lifesteal in these builds yet. Lifesteal is almost essential for sustaining in lane and can swing a fight in your favour by healing you up on the damage you take. So let's take a look at the top builds for a standard hunter that contain lifesteal. We can see 2 very clear favourites here, Devar's Gauntlet and Bloodforge. These items provide good stats outside of just the lifesteal, with Devar's Gauntlet providing lots of strength and flat penetration, and Bloodforge providing lots of strength and some attack speed. But both of these items do lack in lifesteal when compared to some of the other items. Bloodforge is also a good active item, which provides you with a shield and extra lifesteal when you activate it, meaning you can choose when you want these powerful effects, and may easily allow you to win a fight or survive, providing lots of utility when you need it the most. It's worth noting here that without lifesteal in the build, Sharpshooter Arrow has a lower time to kill than Hunter's Cowl, but with lifesteal, the roles have reversed. Here are the top 10 builds for Hunter's Cowl with lifesteal. We can see crit does appear a lot less now, as forcing lifesteal into the builds leaves less room for other crit items, which synergize well together. Here are the top 10 builds for Sharpshooter's Arrow that contain at least one lifesteal item. Crit is still strong with this item, with Deathbringer appearing frequently. But what if you want more lifesteal? I'm now showing you the top 5 builds for each starter item which have above 30% lifesteal. Again, Hunter's Cowl has a milliseconds quicker time to kill than Sharpshooter's Arrow. We can see a clear favourite high lifesteal item, which is the Reaper, which provides lots of strength and lifesteal, but it must be stacked first by killing enemy gods, which is a large drawback to the item. Another drawback is that you only get the full benefits of this item if you hit an enemy god up to 4 seconds ago, which means it is slightly weaker for sustaining when not fighting an enemy god, but it still has a base lifesteal of 25%, which is higher than a fully stacked Devar's Gauntlet. In my simulation, the Reaper has been modelled to only have 3 stacks out of a possible 6. When fully stacked, this item is surely the strongest lifesteal item in the game. We're almost finished for a standard hunter before we move on to specific gods and their builds. But before we move on, I'm aware some people might not like Odysseus' bow due to its inconsistency. This is a very strong item, even stronger than in Smite 1, especially because now Odysseus' bow benefits from the penetration from Executioner, unlike in Smite 1. The 45% attack speed from this item is also crazy good, synergizing greatly with items like Kin's and Sunbeam bow, as well as the passive having massive damage potential. But there is an argument that Odysseus' bow is weak with crit chance, because it provides no strength, and strength combos well with crit chance. I believe that the overall damage of Odysseus' bow and crit chance is strong, as shown in these builds. But for the people that don't want to build Odysseus' bow, here are the top 10 builds that contain lifesteal and don't contain Odysseus' bow. As you can see, crit is stronger with Sharpshooter's Arrow when not building Odysseus' bow, while Hunter's Cowl is a mixed bag of crit builds and non-crit builds. Feel free to swap the lifesteal items out in these builds for the Reaper if you want a higher lifesteal item. Now we can move on to specific gods, and let's start with Anhur. Today we'll be considering him with his aspect, which provides him with up to 100% attack speed when hitting enemy gods, as long as he is always hitting the same target. In my simulation, I have modelled Anhur to have a 70% attack speed bonus, but I do have to mention, this may be a current bug, but Anhur will lose his attack speed bonus if his Odysseus' bow hits any other target. So I will not be considering Odysseus' bow in these builds. If you want to build Anhur without the aspect, look at the builds for a standard hunter. Here are the top 10 builds for Hunter's Cowl. As you can see, crit is highly valued in these top builds for Anhur when he has a plus 70% attack speed buff from his aspect's passive. We can see crit items are strong on him, but you also have the option to have a non-crit build. But this build is super focused on killing tanks the fastest and may leave you susceptible to being killed by junglers, mid laners and other ADCs. As in a straight damage race, they'll likely kill you first because your build is entirely focused around killing tanks. Now let's move on to Sharpshooter's Arrow. We can see more of the same, but now Sunbeam Bow has taken the top spot. This is because the increased basic attack damage from Sharpshooter Arrow increases the damage of Sunbeam Bow, and with Anhur's increased attack speed, the amount of Sunbeam Bow procs you get from this item increases as well, making it a very suitable item for him. I should mention here that in my simulation, Sunbeam Bow has been modelled so that the hunter is only hitting one of the 2 projectiles that come out at all times, meaning its passive is only modelled at half of its total damage potential. If I modelled it at its full potential, it would appear in every top build. Now let's look at Anhur's best builds with lifesteal. As you can see, Devar's Gauntlet and Bloodforge are staples yet again, with crit and yellow damage items being viable for both starter items I've considered. And if you want much more lifesteal, here are the top builds that contain over 30% lifesteal for Anhur for both starter items. If we look and compare these high lifesteal builds to the builds with lower lifesteal, you can see you lose about 1 second time to kill the whole enemy team, which is probably worth it for the much higher sustain. But remember, the Reaper is a risky item as it requires god kills to stack up to do its full damage potential. Now let's move on to Neith, who has a new aspect. Detonating Weaves now gives Neith increased attack speed when she detonates them. She gains 15% attack speed and 2% of her strength as attack speed per stack, and this can stack up to 6 times. This is a unique mechanic to Neith, as no other god has attack speed that increases as their strength increases. She is the only god in the game that could theoretically reach infinite attack speed by buying Elixir of Strength potions. With these changes to her kit, will her builds value high strength items in order to maximise the attack speed from her aspect? In my simulation, Neith has 4 stacks from her passive, which might seem slightly high as they can be difficult to get and maintain, but they do last for 15 seconds, which might make getting and maintaining 6 stacks slightly easier. Here are the top builds with Hunter's Cowl. As we can see, high strength is definitely valued on Neith, as Avatar's Parachute is now in 3 of her top 5 builds. This item is very expensive, but does provide 100 strength, which translates to Neith gaining 8% attack speed from this item alone. That might seem small, but it clearly makes a difference, which is why this item is appearing in her top builds. The top 3 builds also contain no crit and lots of yellow damage. This is because, again, attack speed and strength scale well with Odysseus' bow and Sunbeam Bow, and Neith gains increased attack speed based off of her strength. We can also see Transcendence appearing, another high strength item which adds to her attack speed. Here are her top 10 builds with Sharpshooter's Arrow. Again, we can see instances of Avatar's Parachute, but remember the cost of this item is very high, which might put you off building it. Having Sharpshooter's Arrow still means Neith's builds value higher crit chance, as seen by Deathbringer appearing in every top 10 build. Now here are Neith's top builds that contain lifesteal. Hunter's Cowl builds have completely foregone any crit chance, instead valuing yellow damage items and high strength, and in the 5th build here, we can see double stacking becoming a viable option on Neith when she has 4 stacks of her aspect. Now let's look at builds for Neith that have over 30% lifesteal. For high lifesteal builds, stick to the Reaper. You can keep crit in your builds for Sharpshooter's Arrow, and you should avoid crit when building Hunter's Cowl. And again, let's look at her top builds that don't contain Odysseus' bow, but do have lifesteal. Now that Odysseus' bow has been taken out of the build, crit has become much more favourable, and Avatar's Parachute has completely disappeared from these builds. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly is that with Odysseus' bow out of the build, Kins is now doing much less damage, because Kins benefited greatly from Odysseus' bow's attack speed. So the builds are now not synergising around Kins as much as they were, which means attack speed in general has become slightly less favoured, and it is now better to build around crit chance, and relying on large crit damage to maximise your overall damage. But you can still rely on Sunbeam Bow and Bragg's Harp if you want to go for a yellow damage build. Now let's move on to Cernunnous, who gains flat penetration based off of his intelligence and extra damage on his auto attacks, which increase with his strength or his intelligence depending on which one is higher. Will these 2 effects affect the way you should build Cernunnous? In my simulation, Cernunnous always gains the penetration and extra damage from his first ability, so let's see how this affects his builds. Here are Cernunnous' top builds with Hunter's Cowl. We can see crit has fallen off a lot for this character. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly is that Cernunnous' extra auto attack damage on his first ability cannot crit, but is based entirely off of his strength. This means the builds value crit slightly less as those items tend to provide lower strength. Another reason is that without any attack speed stim in his kit, his builds are desperately looking for attack speed, because Kin's, Odysseus' bow, Sunbeam bow and Bragg's harp are such strong items which scale much better with higher attack speed. Crit items tend to have less attack speed on them, so the builds tend to slightly disfavour them in order to make these yellow damage items better. And then the builds are looking for penetration to ensure maximum DPS against the tankier targets. Cernunnous' first ability scales so well with strength, and essentially means he has an extra yellow damage item naturally in his kit. This synergizes well with building other yellow damage items that also scale off strength. We also see Transcendence appear, which is a super high strength item, but the flat penetration on it is great for Cernunnous, who already gains flat penetration from his first ability. If you've seen my protections and penetration video, you'll know that the more flat penetration you have, the more efficient it becomes. This is why Cernunnous scales so well with other flat penetration items. This is also the reason that Oathsworn Spear appears in these builds, as it provides flat penetration when you hit an enemy god with an ability. Now let's move on to Sharpshooter's Arrow. As we discussed earlier, the crit chance from Sharpshooter's Arrow instantly makes Deathbringer a much stronger item. This effect cascades through the rest of the items chosen, with more crit chance making Deathbringer even more efficient, meaning the builds value high crit chance much more now. It's crazy just how much difference 10% crit chance can make. Here's a comparison of building Sharpshooter's Arrow and Hunter's Cowl on Cernunnous. We can see that the time to kill of these items is practically identical, making the starter items extremely well balanced. Sharpshooter Arrow builds always consist of more crit chance, while Hunter's Cowl favours yellow damage items. Now let's look at Cernunnous' top builds with lifesteal. You still want to build crit with Sharpshooter's Arrow, and Devar's Gauntlet and Bloodforge are still the strongest lifesteal items. If we look at builds with over 30% lifesteal, we can see the Reaper again is the best way to get lots of lifesteal, except for in this build, where a combination of both Devar's Gauntlet and Bloodforge is viable for Cernunnous. This is again because Devar Gauntlet provides flat penetration, which Cernunnous scales well with. In case you want an option that doesn't contain Odysseus' bow, here are the top builds for each starter item with lifesteal and without Odysseus' bow. As you can see, crit is much more highly favoured now in these builds for Hunter's Cowl. Cernunnous also benefits from having intelligence in his build, with his one providing the flat penetration shred I mentioned earlier, along with the slow that scales off of his intelligence, and healing, which also scales off his intelligence. With this in mind, here are Cernunnous' top builds where his intelligence is greater than his strength. I have removed Odysseus' bow from these builds as you will likely want to focus slightly more on abilities than solely auto attacks if you build high intelligence. There are a variety of builds that Cernunnous can go, but you will be sacrificing 3 to 4 seconds on your time to kill the whole enemy team. This might be worth it now that your abilities hit much harder, and that you have an increased heal, slow, and protection shred on your first ability. Now let's look at another recently added hunter, Izanami. Izanami is unique because her auto attacks pierce enemies, meaning she has insane damage potential, being able to hit multiple gods at once. One thing to note about these piercing auto attacks is that yellow damage items like Kin's and Odysseus' bow will only proc on the first enemy hit. If your auto attack pierces an enemy and hits another enemy, your Kin's, Bragg's harp, Odysseus' bow, etc. will not proc on subsequent enemies, but all of the attacks can critically hit, meaning crit items are strong on her if your enemies are lined up. Izanami's first ability is an attack speed stim which stops her auto attacks from piercing, but gives her 50% attack speed and bleed damage on her auto attacks. This bleed damage scales off of your intelligence, hitting up to 50 plus 60% of your intelligence per second. But this effect must be stacked up on the enemy first, which takes 4 auto attacks to achieve. With this in mind, will a high intelligence build be viable on this god? In my model, Izanami hits only one enemy god at a time with her piercing auto attacks. This means that I haven't considered how being able to crit multiple enemies at once could be a factor when building her. I have also modelled her to have her auto attack stim up, ability 1, 50% of the time, with the bleed effect at 100% damage potential during this time. Here are Izanami's top builds with Hunter's Cowl. You can see that extra bleed damage from her first ability scaling off of intelligence does impact her builds when compared to a standard hunter, with our first instance of Obsidian Shard appearing in her top build. It's worth noting that Obsidian Shard has been placed into these builds because of how strong the percent penetration is against tanky targets, and the fact that tankier targets take a long time to kill, so be wary when choosing to go this top build, as it will leave you doing lots of damage to tanks, but not a lot to squishier targets like junglers and other ADCs. We can see other hybrid items appearing, like Bracer of Radiance and Braggy's Heart. The intelligence on these items helps to up Izanami's total damage by adding to her bleed damage. Remember that I have not considered Izanami being able to pierce enemies. If I did, this build would most likely take the top spot for highest damage. But having enemies lined up for you is completely outside of your control, which is why I didn't consider it in these builds. Now let's take a look at Sharpshooter's Arrow. As you would expect, crit is now valued higher, but there are still instances of high intelligence items appearing like Obsidian Shard and Bracer of Radiance. Now let's consider Izanami's lifesteal builds. Here are Izanami's top builds with lifesteal. Devar's Gauntlet seems to be the best on her, and even with lifesteal forced into the builds, you can see that intelligence items still manage to find their way into some of these top builds. Here are Izanami's top builds with over 30% lifesteal. Crit completely falls out of favour when using Hunter's Cowl, which prioritises high pen and yellow damage over crit chance. And there are still high intelligence items like Demonic Grip and Obsidian Shard in here, but again, these builds are optimising to kill tanks and not squishies, so be very careful if you decide to build them. For Sharpshooter's Arrow, crit chance is back on the table, but it is not 100% necessary to do good damage. Here are Izanami's top builds without Odysseus' Bow. Again, a combination of items are appearing, with yellow damage and penetration being mostly favoured for Hunter's Cowl, and crit chance being favoured for Sharpshooter's Arrow. Because I haven't tested Izanami when she's able to hit 2 enemies at the same time, I thought it only fair to include builds with high crit chance in this video. This way, you can decide if you value the builds that will be good for hitting multiple enemy gods at the same time. So here's Izanami's top builds with high crit chance, no Odysseus' Bow and lifesteal. Now let's move on to our next god, Jing Wei, who is an example of a god with many auto attack enhancing abilities. Her first ability provides up to 60% attack speed, and if you stay within the area, her attack speed stim can be active up to 100% of the time. Her second ability gives her splash damage auto attacks and give her an increase to her basic attack damage by 15%. Her third ability gives her extra strength when she dashes. I have modelled Jing Wei to have her explosive bolt up half of the time, and her attack speed stim active half of the time. Due to Jing Wei's increased crit chance and auto attack damage, crit items are preferred on her. The fact that she can get free crit chance instantly makes Deathbringer almost essential in her top builds. Even with Hunter's Cowl as the starter item, which has been shown to be slightly weaker with crit items than Sharpshooter's Arrow. Deathbringer increases the efficiency of other crit items because it increases crit damage overall. But this is also true for Jing Wei's second ability, as she inherently gains crit chance from her kit, so it makes sense that Deathbringer would appear in her top builds. The second build shows crit is not essential on her, and if you want to build a yellow damage build, that is also viable. I have modelled Jing Wei to have her attack speed stim up 50% of the time. Remember that this increased attack speed benefits yellow damage items the most, because the more auto attacks you fire in 1 second means the more yellow damage items you are proccing, and so the higher your DPS. As we move along the list, we can see 7 out of 10 of her top builds contain Deathbringer, and most of those builds contain at least one other crit item. I must say here that the builds with high crit are doing lots of damage to all enemy types, while the non-crit builds are likely optimising to kill tanks and dealing slightly reduced damage to squishy targets. With Sharpshooter's Arrow, the simulation now highly values crit items, with the top 3 builds containing both Deathbringer, and the third build even containing 3 crit items, to fully maximise Jing Wei's crit potential. These builds are much more focused to kill squishy targets fast, and sacrifice a bit of damage on tankier targets, but overall these builds will kill the whole enemy team in the fastest time. The top build is the most interesting, as it seems to devalue attack speed in order to maximise strength and crit chance. This tells us that this build is relying on massive crits to enhance its overall damage, and is relying much less on Odysseus' Bow and Kins. Here is Jing Wei's top builds with lifesteal. We can see Devar's Gauntlet and Bloodforge stay in the top spots. Crit falls off slightly with Hunter's Cowl, as having one lifesteal item in the build forces out another crit item, which reduces the overall efficiency of Jing Wei's crit damage and makes it more viable to leave crit out of the build altogether. Sharpshooter Arrow builds keep crit high, and this is the first instance of sharpshooter arrow builds having a faster time to kill than hunter's cowl builds when we consider lifesteal. This is due to Jing Wei's increased crit chance and basic attack damage synergizing well with sharpshooter arrow and deathbringer. For builds with over 30% lifesteal, the Reaper is the most efficient item, but a combination of both Devar's Gauntlet and Bloodforge can be strong as well. And finally, for the builds that don't contain Odysseus' bow and do contain lifesteal, crit easily takes the top spot and appears in every build, with the core items being Deathbringer, Demon Blade, Executioner and Kins. All of the other items in the builds are replaceable, so you do have lots of choice in whether you want to go for more crit chance in Musharmi's dual swords, more pen with Titan's Bane, or more yellow damage with Braggy's Harp or Sunbeam Bow. Now let's move on to our first magical god on this list, Sol. Sol's passive allows her to gain attack speed, strength, intelligence and extra basic attack damage from building up her heat. At max heat, she gains 25 intelligence, 10 strength and 15% extra basic attack damage. So just how will this affect her builds? For Hunter's Cowl, we can see a solid mix of builds for her. Crit takes the top spot, but not far behind lies a pure yellow damage and penetration build. Again, I want you to bear in mind here that crit has been modelled at its full damage potential, while Sunbeam Bow has been modelled at half of its damage potential, and Odysseus' bow has been modelled at just 2/5 of its total damage potential. So take these numbers with a grain of salt. Avatar's Parachute is appearing in both crit and yellow damage builds, with its super high strength contributing greatly to crit damage and yellow damage numbers. Sol's sharpshooter arrow builds are valuing crit extremely highly. With her increased basic attack damage and strength, crit items scale well with her, because there is a compounding effect between increased basic attack damage and crit chance. Just to note here, in Smite 2, increased basic attack damage does not affect yellow damage items like Odysseus' bow and Sunbeam Bow. Even though these items do scale off of your basic attack damage, they are not affected from increased basic attack damage effects like Sol's passive, Zeus's passive or Jing Wei's 2. This is likely why crit is being valued more than yellow attack damage items for Sol. Here are Sol's top builds with at least one lifesteal item. Sharpshooter Arrow is slightly favoured on Sol when it comes to killing the whole enemy team in the fastest time, with a lifesteal item. Devar's Gauntlet and Bloodforge are the best lifesteal items yet again, and yellow damage is better for Hunter's Cowl, while crit is better with Sharpshooter's Arrow. Here are the top builds with over 30% lifesteal. Again, the Reaper is a clear winner here, while Bloodforge and Devar's Gauntlet are still a viable combination for high lifesteal builds, while you also get the benefits of having the Bloodforge shield. For builds without Odysseus' bow and with lifesteal, crit is a clear favourite, with 2 of the top builds containing 3 crit items. We also see the addition of Lernean bow, which is there to make up for the attack speed lost when I removed Odysseus' bow from these builds. And now we can move on to the final god I'll be considering in this video, Zeus. Zeus can build up charges on enemy gods. Once an enemy god has 3 charges, they will take 60% extra auto attack damage from Zeus. This is a very strong effect and may make Zeus a viable ADC, even though he is extremely lacking in movement, and it can be slightly difficult to keep enemies fully charged. For my simulation, Zeus has been modelled to always have 2 charges on the enemy, giving him plus 40% basic attack damage to all targets. This was the best way I could think of to average out Zeus hitting enemies who are fully charged and enemies that have no charge at all. Remember that this increased auto attack damage will affect how much he crits for, but not how much his Odysseus' bow or Sunbeam Bow will hit for. Zeus also gains up to 35% attack speed from his second ability, so I have modelled him to have an additional 20% attack speed at all times. For Zeus, you most likely want to go for a crit build to take advantage of his extra basic attack damage. But just for completion, I'm going to run over each scenario I have already run over. You can then choose how you want to build and play him, but personally, I would go for a crit build without Odysseus' bow, which I'll show you later. For Hunter's Cowl, crit is clearly a favourite for Zeus with his massive increase to basic attack damage. Crit becomes almost essential for this god, even with Hunter's Cowl. This third build focuses almost solely on crit, taking advantage of his increased auto attack damage. The top 6th build shows us that crit isn't essential on him, but remember, I modded him at 40% increased basic attack damage, not his maximum which is plus 60%. Sharpshooter arrow builds again show a clear tendency towards high crit chance, with this second build maximising strength to make the enhanced crits hit even harder. High strength scales well with Zeus because he gains a percent increase to basic attack damage, and basic attack damage is increased by strength, which is then compounded again by crit, creating a kind of positive feedback loop between strength, crit and increased auto attack damage. Now that that's out of the way, let's look at Zeus's top builds without Odysseus' bow and with lifesteal. This will maximise single target damage, which is what Zeus's playstyle encourages, sticking on one target, getting them to maximum charge and doing insane damage with his auto attacks. Even with lifesteal and no Odysseus' bow in the builds, Zeus's time to kill is the lowest we have seen so far, which shows the insane impact of his increased auto attack damage can have. My personal preference would be to pick these type of builds going into a game. Kinsblade and Executioner are still shown to be essential in order to kill tanks quickly, with Titan's Bane being a bit more flexible. You can choose to go for Titan's Bane to kill the tanks quicker, or another crit item or attack speed item in order to kill the squishies faster. I haven't modelled Cupid or Medusa in this video, as Cupid only gains up to a 40% increase to attack speed, which will not affect her overall builds when compared to a standard hunter, and Medusa has access to Viper Shot, which does increase attack speed and damage, but only for 4 auto attacks, and so is not for a set amount of time like other hunters on this list, so I decided not to model her. Instead, look at the builds for a standard hunter, or if you want to build her ability based, look to builds with high intelligence. There are also active items available to hunters which might seem appetizing, like Dagger of Frenzy and Death Metal. If you feel as though these items would benefit you, swap out one of the non-core items from the builds in this video. And that's everything from me. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and remember, don't guess, do the math.